Presidential politics invade the political days at the state fair. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. We've had a busy week in Springfield with the State Fair political days. We'll talk plenty about that. With me today, a veteran of the Springfield scene, Mike Lawrence is here. Good to see you, Mike.
Good to be here.
Longtime journalist. He was Jim Edgar's press secretary and ended his career. Well, he's still doing stuff, of course, but also was director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at SIU for a while. Mark Maxwell is here. He's back. He is Capitol Bureau Chief for WCIA Channel 3.
Busy week.
Welcome back. It was indeed, Mark. And you have to carry your own camera. So how do you do that? It's a new day. Let's talk, we're going to get to political days in a minute. Let's talk about school funding, because as we tape the show, the governor is, I think, doing something about floods and something at a school in Aurora, if I recall, on Friday. But he had encouraged the four leaders of the legislature to meet about school funding. Some schools have opened already. We have missed the first school aid payment because the legislature has not yet agreed to do with Senate Bill 1, which is a new school aid formula to try to be more fair in distribution of dollars. The governor says too much goes to Chicago. He vetoed it, made a lot of changes in the bill with a mandatory veto. Democrats say they don't like those changes and are working toward a resolution. Mark, where is this headed? Any idea?
Well, now it's real. Schools are opening their doors, and for the first time in known history, school districts are coming to the state asking for money. The school is turning them away empty-handed. That's because of a provision in the budget which killed effectively the old funding formula and said we must have a new funding formula in place before we unlock the some $6.5 billion in school funding reserves waiting to go out across the state. So that's what brought us to this point, and now there's a lot of finger pointing and blame. We expect a veto showdown and override on Wednesday of next week, where Speaker Madigan has said the House does plan to try and override Governor Rauner's veto, but if that falls apart, there's a few other ways they might try to inch toward a compromise.
Yeah, and of course the Senate has already voted to override the veto, with all Democrats voting for it and one Republican, Sam McCann, saying we shouldn't just have a state run by one person, the governor, which Sam McCann, as a Republican from Macoupin County, has taken on the governor before and was had a primary opponent in 2016, which he ended up beating, but it was millions of dollars. Mike, do you see a resolution coming to this? The budget impasse went on for a couple years before there was a resolution, but with school funding has always seemed more sacrosanct to both sides in the Governor Rauner versus Democrats in the legislature fight.
Yes, I think there's considerably more pressure here to reach an agreement, and from what I'm hearing, the best route would be a negotiated agreement that would involve both Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, we'll see where that goes. One of the side issues that has been thrown into this that could become part of an agreement, which is interesting, is Blaise Supich, the Catholic cardinal of the Chicago Archdiocese, has been in discussion with state leaders, on Democrats and the governor, and talking about tax credits that people could donate to, like, Catholic schools and get I think a dollar for dollar break on their state taxes. Possibly they're talking about an idea of $100 million. I know some people say that is almost an exact we're not supposed to do. I heard Chris Kennedy, one of the Democratic candidates, talking on the radio yesterday, saying he thought that would violate our Constitution because we're not supposed to fund private schools, although I think there have been some ways public school parents have been able to get some tax breaks in Illinois before, I think for school supplies or something. Does that look like it's going to be part of the deal, or do we know yet? Obviously, we don't know at this moment.
Well, Speaker Madigan earlier this week would not commit. He would not answer questions, but he did say that he's taking a look at the information, which seems to suggest he's keeping that as a card at his disposal. It may be something he decides to deal in a negotiation. But the opposition to this is very strong. Some in the public education sector feel that this is not just opening the exit doors from school students to leave public schools for private, but that it's laying that groundwork, incentivizing the off-ramp and building a path. And the reason why that's also important, because Governor Rauner's school funding plan, detailed in his mandatory veto, would follow dollars from districts where the students go. So if enrollment declined 50% at a district, and half the kids for some reason uprooted and went to a private school, there's a lot of money and a lot of power at play in this school funding. It's a lot more than just whether or not schools get their paychecks. There's a lot of different infrastructure being built for what will almost certainly become a legal battle in the years to come.
Interesting. Yeah, and of course another part of that mandatory veto, the governor, and it was kind of discovered along the way, he's basically saying that if local communities have tax increment financing districts, TIF districts, which take usually a blighted area, it's not always that way, but it's supposed to be for a blighted area, and they designate that area, then property taxes from that area go into a fund that can help revitalize that area with economic development, but schools don't get that money. And the governor's mandatory veto says those dollars should not be counted toward what schools can get from the state now. And Mike, you've seen the development of TIF districts. Clearly Chicago would be hurt badly by that, and the governor seems to have aimed at Chicago, but there are also TIF districts all over the state.
Absolutely, and the other element of that mandatory veto, it would have required the inclusion in the formula computation for property tax caps. Mm-hmm. In other words, for evaluation that school districts can't access because of the caps. So it's not only the TIF district, I mean, it's essentially, he's saying money that the school districts don't have access to ought to be counted against them.
Yeah, as if they did, to lower what they get from the state.
In their state aid.
Yeah, I know in Chicago he talks about hiding property tax wealth through TIF districts, but really, again, that's aimed at Chicago, and I know Springfield has several TIF districts, and the schools might lose, so it's kind of an interesting thing.
And the argument from Governor Rauner's administration, also from the Illinois Policy Institute, is that there's a long line of 852 school districts in line at the state trying to get money. The poorest districts should be at the front of the line. Nobody disagrees. They should also walk away with the largest money bags from the state. They should get the most money to help the kids that are in poverty reach adequacy in the classroom. Nobody disagrees. But what it comes down to is how much goes to those districts in front, and are districts cutting in line by hiding property tax wealth, or by saying our district isn't as rich as it truly is because we've borrowed from our future property taxes. And so that's where we start to involve the future and borrowing from yourself, and it gets very complicated financially. But there's a question of whether or not school districts have more money or property areas are being properly evaluated and assessed. And it all drives back to that property tax campaign cornerstone that will be a big part of any foundation from Governor Rauner. Even Chris Kennedy has made property taxes a big part of his campaign.
Saying how unfair they are. And there was a big Tribune series where they talked about property taxes and how rich properties are often underassessed and poorer areas often are overassessed, and so it's as if the system is bad. And then there's, if Speaker Madigan and businesses like his make money because they can help people lower their property taxes through a legal process. This situation, and you mentioned the Illinois Policy Institute, they have a cartoonist on contract. He did a cartoon that came out this week, and it caused a bit of a firestorm. And it's about this TIF district thing. It shows kind of a heavy, white, older man with TIF money, tax increment financing, coming in one pocket, but showing an empty pocket to a small African-American child with apparently a Cubs hat, sitting on the ground with a backpack and holding a sign saying, "Need money for school." This would be that cartoon. And it ended up being kind of savaged on the House floor, not only by Democrats, but by some Republicans, saying that this was kind of a racist view of, a young black child asking for money from a white person. And the Policy Institute said that's a distraction, we're not racist, but they did take it down from their website. Mike, any thoughts about what this means? I guess with Governor Rauner hiring those folks, it puts him closer to the Policy Institute, to which he has contributed more than $500,000.
Yeah, he's been a supporter, and he's been largely supported by the Policy Institute. And I think that cartoon, if it's not racist, it's the first cousin of racism. It evokes stereotypes that racists have.
Yeah, Mark, I know the governor was on radio in Chicago and saying, as he has to several other news stories over time, he'd never seen the cartoon. And so I don't know exactly where that goes, but it is just the cartoon controversy hit one day, and then the next day Democrats came to the state fair, and perhaps we can talk about that. And so there was a linkage of what's going on with school funding by some Democrats to kind of the racial makeup of various parts of the state.
It's really a sad story because I think the timing is very unfortunate as well. This comes on the heels of what happened in Charlottesville, and there was a lot of passion in the House floor when leaders from both sides stood up. There was a standing ovation when Jamie Andrade, a House representative from the Chicago area, used expletives to describe what he thought about that cartoon. And it moved a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats alike. Some people even jeered on Twitter as they followed along and said it took the Illinois Policy Institute to bring some bipartisanship to Springfield over this issue. So it was really interesting to see that. But undergirding this entire thing is a truth and a reality that economically kids of color are raised disproportionately without access to the same education or the same upward mobility in this state. And you look at unemployment rates and you look at graduation rates, the realities, they're a lot more harsh than any cartoon. And so it would behoove politicians in Illinois not to just try to take the one-day headline and stand up on their soapbox and win this headline, but maybe do something to fix that structure.
Okay. And
well, I would say another factor in this, and why another reason why the cartoon became an issue, is that Governor Rauner, a big part of his effort on this school funding issue is to go downstate and tell downstaters that he's standing up for them. Chicago is ripping off the bailout. And so
don't bail out Chicago. Your tax dollar. Yeah.
And unfortunately, that can be interpreted as a racial matter as well. Regardless of what Governor Rauner's intent is.
Right. Just because the city of Chicago has a much more diverse population than some places downstate. Although the Governor Rauner, he's been trying to defend against this before the cartoon and probably after, saying, you know, there's Peoria and Rockford and, you know, Danville. Look, these other cities also have poor kids and racially diverse populations, and I'm trying to help everybody. But I do remember he said here once on a radio station that he talked to in the morning, you know, I'm for all people in Chicago too. I love, you know, I represent everyone. And then he went to New Berlin, which is a small rural school, and actually told an assembly of kids there, I don't think your parents should be paying money to bail out Chicago, which is a similar argument as to what he's given in this whole thing.
There's another map going around from Democrats that started to circulate as well, which shows a county-by-county breakdown of the tax distribution levels and how much money comes into Springfield from counties.
Let's see if I have it. Keep talking.
In Chicago, I believe it's about $1.20 that goes to Springfield for every dollar they get back, and many downstate districts, including many of the ones that are rural and sparsely populated, they send 80 cents to Springfield for every dollar they get back. Now, this was a very simplistic map. It didn't include a lot of the finer details and the different moving parts that can really change the tax distribution levels. But this is sort of a counter argument to the idea that Chicago is being bailed out, and they look and say Cook County is actually an economic engine. But that also should come with a major asterisk, that not every person in Cook County contributed. I mean, there's some millionaires that live in Trump Tower that cast a shadow on some dark areas that have very little economic opportunity, that have high crime, that have shootings. And those people that are truly the ones in need are not the ones that are contributing a lot of the economic wealth and that's coming from Chicago to Springfield. So there's such disparity in Chicago that it really is a very complicated mess politically in a reality, and it just sends a lot of really complicated signals, and people that live in Cairo or people, they don't really stop and they don't walk the streets of Michigan and 35th, or they don't see what's happening there. So it's easier to say, let's not bail out that place than it is to sit down and explain how we got there.
Right. And
You,
you have a very
you know, Governor Rauner is not the first, and he won't be the last politician to play the regionalism card.
correct.
And we've had that from people in both parties.
That's
through
Dan
the
Walker
years.
did it. I'm going to beat the machine.
Yes, exactly. So, but it's unfortunate in the sense that we are one state eventually, and the diversity of Illinois should be one of its strengths, and yet it's used sometimes to divide people
Interesting, yeah.
rather than unite them.
Yeah, and at Democrat Day, Senator Dick Durbin at the big brunch that replaced, they've had a big brunch for years, the Democratic County Chairman's Association, and they had 1,800 people this year, so it was a big deal. And there was some news because the party itself didn't have a regular rally at the fairgrounds after that, which often is the same speeches anyway. But Durbin said that it's beneath the dignity of the governorship to divide the state, and he was talking about just that. And there was more, certainly from the Democrats. All right, let me just do a quick list of the candidates for governor, some of you whom you've heard of them, some of whom you've not. Alex Pederickas, Tio Hardiman, Democratic side. Scott Drury, State Representative. Chris Kennedy, you've heard of him, RFK's son. J.B. Pritzker, who's doing a lot of TV ads. Bob Diber from downstate. Robert Marshall, who used to be a Republican and wants to divide our state into 4 states. And Daniel Biss, state senator from Evanston. And Amewa Pawar, who is an alderman in Chicago of Indian descent. He talked about his heritage. He married a Jewish white woman, worried that his 2-year-old might be considered the other in a state with this kind of commentary, and said some of the most strongest anti-Rauner talk, putting the racial thing in, saying that something like the amendatory veto of Senate Bill 1 on education, which is pitting poor white kids from downstate against poor black and brown kids in Chicago, is a step toward Charlottesville, which I don't know if you think that goes too far, but that's what he said. And that was some of what came out of the Democrat Day events.
That may be partially true in perception, but I'm afraid it also misses a big portion of the reality, which would combine with the national political discourse. A lot of Americans in middle America feel they're forgotten, and they're ruled by the ruling class, the liberals in San Francisco and the liberals in New York City. And you see that argument. This is the big part of America that came out to elect Donald Trump in the heartland. And there are a lot of people downstate who look at Chicago very much the same thing, a liberal bastion that stands there with a bunch of people that, to talk about stereotype, well, we'll stay away from that. But there's just a lot of people who look at Chicago as this liberal city that's out of touch with my reality in a very rural state.
Right.
And so they...
Although if you go neighborhood to neighborhood in Chicago, there's really all kinds of folks, including a lot of blue-collar folks who probably voted for Donald Trump, too.
There very well may be, and there probably are racial elements in that perception, but there are also economic elements that I think really drive this. And Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, who was the keynote speaker, mentioned that. So did State Senator Daniel Biss. They said we have to have an economic message, and you see sort of a revival of that from Bill Clinton's days, where he said we have to feel your pain, and James Carville saying it's the economy's stupid. The Democrats are trying to find themselves right now in a country where governors have the overwhelming majority. Right. They have the White House, they have the Senate, they have the House of Representatives, and Democrats are trying to say we need to find our economic message and bring that
and Hillary
back.
Clinton lost, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, right?
Right.
One thing that did come out of Democrat Day that got a standing ovation, it was everybody on the Democratic side is probably pretty happy about this. Jesse White, who is 83 years old, said he will run for a 6th term. Mike, was that expected? He said it's a matter of duty to him.
I think it was expected. He will now, have 20 years in as Secretary of State at the end of this term, so he's asking for 4 more years. I think Jesse White is generally credited with doing a good job as Secretary of State, but I think we need to be asking ourselves a question of how long people ought to be in these executive offices and whether we ought to be looking at term limits. At the end of her current term, Lisa Madigan will have been the Attorney General for 16 years. And again, I think she's been generally credited with doing a good job. But I think rising young stars, or at least young stars, who want to rise, and they're not rising because people are staying in office. So again, regardless of the viewpoint on whether Secretary White and General Madigan have done a good job, I think it'd be healthy to have a discussion on term limits for executive officers and for legislative leaders as well.
Okay, and clearly that will become part of the debate this next election season. As Mark knows, Erica Harold on the Republican side is a rising star, because I know you interviewed her for something you've got coming up, which you.
Well, she wants to be a rising star. In
Yeah,
politics, she hasn't quite
was,
achieved that status yet.
Right. She ran for Congress in 2014 as a Republican candidate against Rodney Davis in Illinois 13. She is a lawyer and from Urbana, and was also 2003 Miss America, and as a Republican who is announced for Attorney General and was one of the stars of their political day. And she says Lisa Madigan, hasn't dealt with government corruption enough. And Lisa Madigan and her people say, well, state's attorneys and U.S. attorneys do that. We do help local state's attorneys. We do get involved in these cases as we can with our resources, but we don't have the resources of the federal government, for example. So how's this looking? She's also got conservative views that may or may not some of the more liberal tendencies of Illinois on abortion, for example. But
I asked her about
she's
that.
She's also running against Lisa Madigan, who is a Madigan and the daughter of House Speaker Michael Madigan.
Well, as any Miss America contestant has learned, she knows how to answer a question and she knows how to dodge a question. They have to take a lot of questions up there on that stage. And so I asked her about HB 40 and this bill that's winding its way. It's a pro-choice bill that would protect Illinois access to abortion in the case that Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Right.
And she successfully, several times, dodged that question and said, my job as Attorney General would be to uphold and defend the law as written. So she wouldn't really weigh in and put a position on that, but we do know from years past in her races for Congress in a Republican primary that she's been vocal about some of her pro-life positions. So she dodged that question. But she's also telling a story. And she's starting out, her first campaign ad, her first public appearances, is that Illinois is corrupt, and that I'm going to help stop it. So she's saying that she's going to be the cop who fights corruption in Illinois, and that's a story that I think plays really, really well.
Right.
Can she use it to unseat a Madigan?
And many attorneys general and candidates, therefore, have tried to do that. I remember once who had a campaign sticker, less attorney, more general, and he was George Ryan's candidate one year, and he got nowhere. But you never know what happens.
Well, I think it plays well.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, in Illinois, historically, and as a matter of law, the Attorney General has not had the role of going after corruption.
Right. Yeah. It's mostly a civil, environmental, consumer protection.
And that's by design.
Yeah.
There have been Attorney Generals through the years. Bill Scott, Ty Feener, we're talking about ancient history here, who sought statewide grand jury power so they could go after corruption.
Right.
And the legislature made the decision they weren't going to have that power.
Right.
So
But,
that's not an
right.
That is just a matter of fact.
Right. And I do want to, just before we have a few minutes left, and I do want to talk a little about President Trump and Republican Day at the State Fair, because Republican Day at the State Fair came one day after President Trump's basically third set of comments about what happened in Charlottesville, right, when he was widely panned for saying there are good people on both sides, including kind of the white supremacists, or at least those in that group with Nazi flags and things. So basically at the State Fair rally, President Trump's name wasn't mentioned, but when the governor arrived at the State Fair, he was asked by reporters, what do you think of what Trump said? And basically for the first time, and he even used Trump's name when prodded by another reporter, he said, I think it was terrible. I think it's bad for America. You have to be unequivocal in talking down injustice and racism, which is possibly difficult for Governor Rauner with his own base, because he doesn't want to lose people who are attached to Trump, which is why the governor has almost never said Trump's name in months, at least that we have seen.
Well, and President Trump, if you don't know by now, is someone who enjoys a fight, perhaps more than he enjoys to win. And in this case, I think what he was trying to do, if you take his comments in their full context on day 3, when he went back in and said there were good people on both sides, his full context there was that there were some people he thought drawn to the statue of General Robert E. Lee because they believed in the historical value of that, and that they were not connected to the white supremacists, that they were separate groups. So that was the full context of the case he was trying to make. What a lot of people are scratching their heads about is why go there at all when a nation is staggering after seeing some very visceral images of Nazi armbands and Nazi salutes down the streets.
And the torches at night
and
in a parade,
Shouldn't a president's job be to try to heal a nation and to let them know they're safe?
Yeah, well, that's clearly a national discussion as we go on. I will say that in the official comments from the stage at the State Fair, the governor was very strongly against the Democratic Chicago machine, Mike Madigan, as usual. What's interesting is it also came out this week that there have been a lot of emailing going on between Diana Rauner, the First Lady, and people in the governor's administration, and a couple of those emails leaked. One of them was
most of them were blocked.
Most of them were blocked, but one of them said, I wouldn't say Speaker Madigan. I would keep saying the majority party or something like that. My other edits below. Apparently, according to the Sun-Times story, Mrs. Rauner has had a significant say in some of the governor's speeches and trying to get him perhaps not to say Mike Madigan so much, but he did accuse Madigan of basically being corrupt with his tax business this time again. Good or bad, the governor, Mark, I think you were there, lashed out before this article appeared.
It was a preemptive strike.
Yeah, saying don't attack my wife.
A lot of politicians will have this response. I think that was expected. They'll bristle at the notion of their family being brought in. But there is a real policy question about if she's having 300, 350 emails back and forth with the governor's chief of staff, she's directing policy, she's helping to advise on policy decisions. There was a Freedom of Information Act request filed, and that was rejected flat out by the governor, and that probably will be appealed. But again, if there's anything to glean from the few emails we did get a look at, it's that Bruce Rauner has more of a stomach for a personal one-on-one fight, a cage match, than his wife does. And it seems that she's losing that battle at persuading him to change his mind because, as you pointed out, just Wednesday on Governor's Day, he took to the stage in front of a bunch of Republicans who wore Fire Madigan shirts and said Mike Madigan has to go.
Right. Yeah, and Mike, I'm going to end on this note. You talked about term limits, but a lot of legislators are leaving on their own this year. Bill Hayne, very nice man, Democrat, state senator from Alton. He has been suffering from a form of cancer. He announced he's not running again. Steve Anderson of Geneva, who was for a while the floor leader, but voted to override the governor on the budget, said things are too political in Springfield. So are term limits really needed if all these folks are leaving?
Well, I'm not sure I favor term limits for rank and file.
Oh, you mentioned leaders. That's right. You mentioned leaders.
But the point is that a lot of the people who are leaving are recognized as good people.
Indeed.
And we're going to both sides of the aisle.
And that's a positive note on which we'll end. Thank you, Mike Lawrence, Mark Maxwell. Thanks for your help. Thank you for watching. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.